thank you, Dr. Bekong. I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and spend some time talking with you about the information technology industry and what we see today, what we believe will happen going forward, and some of the challenges and issues that are out there ahead of us. And these are going to be issues that certainly all of us that are involved in the industry are going to have to deal with, whether we live in Korea or the U.S. or Europe, Japan, it doesn't matter. We're all going to be facing these challenges. But I think you'll also see, as my discussion unfolds, that the benefits of all of the things that we're doing have broad and deep implications for all of the people of our countries around the world and for our economies more broadly. And I was the chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve Bank for a number of years and got heavily involved in monetary policy and the issues driving monetary policy. And certainly productivity is one of those very important ingredients that we look at constantly. And the IT industry is a very, very important contributor to that productivity enhancement that has been taking place for the last many years. So the title of my talk is The Global Scramble for IT Leadership, Winners and Losers. We're now in the early stages of a global scramble for this leadership in information technology. And while the U.S. has been the undisputed leader in information technology for the last nearly 50 years, we are now in the early stages of a transition from silicon-based semiconductors that are the driving force for the information technology world to the nano-electronics era, which will begin to really take hold some 10 to 15 years down the road. This transition will require the use of new materials, new device structures, new manufacturing methods. A whole new area of activity will have to unfold. It will truly be a revolution in technology. And I think, as we all know, periods of revolution invariably offer opportunities for new leaders to emerge. So, the CMOS scaling era that we have been in for the last 30 or 40 years is now coming to its close. We'll run up against the limits of physics in about 10 to 15 years. And the nano era will then take over, and that will be the challenge and the opportunity for the 50 years that follows. Many countries around the world are now seeking leadership in IT by funding basic research, educating scientists and engineers, creating incentives for investment by high technology industries, and nurturing the development of domestic IT companies. The strategic importance of leadership in information technology to a country's economic growth, productivity, standard of living, and national security has become readily evident to leaders of countries everywhere. Information technology makes enormous contributions to enhancing productivity of workers, enabling them to earn higher wages while producing goods and services that command higher prices and provide greater value throughout the marketplace. As we will see, information technology is the most important contributor to productivity growth, not only in the U.S., but in countries around the world. In the United States, which has led this economic growth for the last many years, information technology industries have accounted for 25% of all economic growth, while making up only 3% of the gross domestic product. Increasing worker productivity will become critically important for many of the world's industrialized nations in the years ahead, and that includes both Korea and the United States. We'll soon feel the effects of an aging population, and with that, fewer workers will be available and therefore required to support the needs of aging citizens. And dramatically increased productivity is the only viable solution to deal with that issue that is out ahead of us. The purpose of this talk, then, is to examine the evolution of the information technology industry over the past century, because I think we get some context if we look at it in that way, starting with the advent of the vacuum tube, which you see on the screen, and going forward to new devices such as carbon tubes and nanotechnology and all the related biotechnology that will be associated with that. To learn what business models and policies foster advances in innovation and technology is going to be a critical aspect of how this unfolds. Now, the modern era of electronics can be traced to the invention of the vacuum tube in the early 1900s. The vacuum tube, essentially a switch, became the fundamental building block for all electronic systems for the first 50 years of the last century. The Marconi radio was the first major innovative application enabled by the vacuum tube. So for that first 50 years, it was the building block for electronics. But scientists soon realized that although it was a very good device and it helped to do certain things, that it had practical limitations of size and power consumption. And with that, there was a problem in dealing with the issues and opportunities that lay ahead. So it was clear that we needed to do something different. Now, the first digital computer, known as the ENIAC, for electronic numerical integrator and computer, graphically demonstrates why it was essential to find an alternative to the vacuum tube. This machine, which was unveiled in 1946, weighed 30 tons, took up 1,800 square feet of space, and consumed 150 kilowatts of power to operate 17,000 vacuum tubes. So you just think about that. We'll put that in context. Now, it was a marvel for its time, and yet it lacked the capability to provide the kind of computing power that was needed. And in fact, the compute capability of that machine can now be purchased for about $5 in one of the handheld devices that many of you have. Maybe you can throw them away because you have something far more sophisticated than that now. So clearly there was a need for a new switch that could operate at low power, could be scaled to enable more practical electronic devices. So the invention of the transistor at Bell Labs in 1947 launched the era of microelectronics. Bell Labs continued to serve as a source of innovation until the U.S. government ordered the breakup of AT&T in the 1980s. And as we were saying at breakfast a few minutes ago, in my view, one of the great mistakes that was made by the legal system in the U.S. The contributions that were made by Bell Labs are now, we're working in different ways to try and replicate what that great research institute provided us. The transistor radio is the most notable symbol of the transition from vacuum tube to the transistor. The next breakthrough occurred about a decade later with the invention of the integrated circuit. And that was jointly credited to Jack Kilby at TI and Bob Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor. In 1965, Gordon Moore, then a young engineer at Fairchild, and later one of the co-founders of Intel, observed the advances in technology in the integrated circuit area had allowed a doubling of the number of transistors on a chip every year since the invention of the integrated circuit. That observation, as most of you may know, is known as Moore's Law, and the rate of doubling has continued ever since that time, and we believe we'll be able to continue to maintain that until we get to the ultimate CMOS era conclusion here in 10 to 15 years. For 4 decades, the semiconductor industry has distinguished itself by the rapid pace of improvement in products. One metric that describes this best is the improvement in memory chips. And again, with 2 of the largest, most successful, most important memory companies in the world here in Korea, the Samsung and Hynix, you know a lot about this. The early DRAM, the first one developed in 1970, had the capacity of 1,000 bits. Today's DRAM can hold 32 billion bits and about that same piece of real estate. And if you looked at the cost of a bit of memory, and I'll just take it for the last 10 years. If you bought a bit of memory in 1995, today you would pay 2% of that 1995 cost to buy that same bit of memory. If you go back to the first days, it's less than 1/1,000,000th of the price of the earliest. Today's most advanced microchips have just about 1 billion transistors on that same piece of real estate that is smaller than the thumbnail that you have. The applications for powerful new integrated circuits with ever-increasing functionality are limited only by human imagination and creativity. We're going to be able to continue to make these devices smaller, faster, lower cost for the next 15 years until we run up against the laws of physics with CMOS scaling. So the challenge is to continue to reduce that cost per function 25% per year and use those gains to drive productivity and enhance competitiveness of all of our industries around the world. I read just a few weeks ago that Mr. Oh Sang-rak of Korea's Minister of Information and Communication announced a personal goal to put a robot in every home by 2010. Now, South Korea already is the world's most wired country, with 72% of all households having broadband service, so I have little doubt that Mr. Rak's goal will be achieved. He said he also hopes these robots will help children learn English and sing and dance for them when they get bored. So you can imagine a babysitter that will entertain your children while teaching them proper English. And I would just hope that Mr. Rak has plans to export these robots to the U.S. where our children can learn Korean, and together I will have a better communication going back and forth, all via the robot instructor. But it's instructive to look at the business models that have evolved and helped drive this technology through the various transitions in the past 50 years. The business models evolve very differently in the U.S., in Europe, Japan, and Asia Pacific. And I think there's something to be learned from this as we think about who will be the leaders going forward and what will it take to get there. This slide shows how the evolution took place in the U.S. In the U.S. in 1950, 6 companies were the major suppliers of vacuum tubes: GE, RCA, Raytheon, Sylvania, Philco, and Westinghouse. All vertically integrated, substantial internal consumption of their products. By 1960, when transistors and integrated circuits began to come forward, the number of new players emerged, including Texas Instruments, Motorola, and Fairchild. Intel, which became the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer in 1992, was founded in 1968, one of many startups in the chip industry during that era, and only a few of which really survived. By 2004, another new group of players emerged, and that was when the fabless business model came into being. That was exemplified by companies like Qualcomm, Broadcom, Xilinx, Altera, and a whole host of others. Fabless companies focused on creating innovative designs, relying on independent manufacturing facilities known as foundries to do the actual manufacturing. Now, there was one exception to this story as it unfolded, and that was IBM. They're notable in that they have been a leader from the very first. They were a leader when the industry got started back in the 1950s, and they continue to be a leader today. They don't show up on these tables only because it was only recently that they began to sell their products into the commercial market. Up to that time, they had consumed all of their production internally. So with the exception of IBM, none of the leaders of 1950 are major factors in IT today in the U.S. In the United States, excellent research universities, a strong entrepreneurial culture, the availability of venture capital to fund startups, and the nimbleness and the quickness of new, highly focused companies resulted in major changes in both industry leadership and in the basic business model. Now in Europe, there was a very different pattern. Three companies dominated the vacuum tube business in Europe in the 1950s. The transition from tubes to transistors and later to integrated circuits did little to change the order of the leading European companies. In the 1970s, the French and Italian governments recognized the growing strategic importance of microelectronics and funded new ventures known as Thomson and SGS. In the 1990s, the Italian and French ventures merged to form ST, but Philips and Siemens, the leaders in the vacuum tube era, were still among the top three European microelectronics manufacturers. Today, the microelectronics business of Siemens has now been spun off. The company is now known as Infineon, but otherwise the order has not changed much from what it was back at the start of this effort in the 1950s and beyond. So unlike the evolution of the U.S. industry, startups have not played a major role in Europe. Whether it's due to cultural differences, a lack of readily available private venture capital, or the desire for entrepreneurial efforts, I think that's something we can speculate. But nonetheless, the pattern, as we can see, is vastly different. Now, the evolution of the Japanese business model reflects the unique culture of Japan, I think. All the leaders of 1950 were vertically integrated. By the 1960s, a rare startup, Sony, came on the scene and became a major player. And they built their business around consumer electronics, but they were not ever a part of a Keiretsu. Major changes to industry structure in Japan are a relatively recent phenomenon. Ellipta memory resulted from the combination of DRAM business of NEC and Hitachi in 1999, while semiconductor operations of Hitachi and Mitsubishi merged to create Renesas in 2003. Japanese industrial policy and the Keiretsu system tended to favor and nurture existing companies as opposed to entrepreneurial startups. So the startups have been a rather rare commodity in the manufacturing, or in the Japanese market. However, you see a little change taking place there today. The rest of Asia Pacific, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore primarily, and now with China coming on the scene, came on a bit later, as you can see from this slide. Samsung, Gold Star, and Hyundai were the largest IC suppliers in the 1990s. They got started in the late 80s and became real players as we got into the 90s. An important development in the 1980s was that foundry, fabless model I talked about a minute ago that has become a more important factor. And that's been the driving force for at least the Taiwan portion of what is taking place. Where the Korean portion of it has been the integrated companies, again, like Samsung, LG, Hyundai earlier, Hynix now. But it's interesting because these are leaders in the industry today. They aren't just a part of the industry. When you look at the Asia Pacific, TSMC, UMC in Taiwan, Charter to a lesser degree in Singapore, are leaders in the foundry business. They are very, very good technology companies and providing an excellent service to the fabless design companies. We now see in China the first phases of that same thing evolving with SMIC and Grace, Huahong, and others coming on with foundries, and we're beginning to see the first fabless companies there. For Korea, we have the vertically integrated companies, the great successes of Samsung, Hynix now, LG. So again, entrepreneurial energy played a part of the role in some segments of the Asian market. The vertically integrated companies played it in other places. So it was a combination of the business model of the U.S. and the business model of Japan, to a lesser degree Europe, that fostered what has taken place thus far in the Asia-Pacific market. So industrial policy did play a role in shaping the microelectronics of this region. The fabless business model now, which is only a few years old, because it really go back to about 1990 when it got started, but it was almost 2000 before it became a real factor, now has about 20% of the world market and is becoming larger all the time. I do think there is a limitation that they'll bump up against at some stage. I'm not sure exactly where that is. If I had to guess, I would say somewhere in the vicinity of 40% of the overall market. There are several other evolutionary changes and trends in the industry that are worth noting. First, in the earliest days of the IC industry, companies out of necessity were horizontally integrated, and they did everything. We grew our own wafers, we made our own manufacturing equipment, wire bonders, furnaces, you name it, all of that. And we even mixed our own chemicals. Over time, those specialized firms emerged to supply a vast array of equipment, materials, and other products, and formed an infrastructure for the industry, which is very, very strong and important today. And again, it's resident around the world. Some of these companies were spin-offs, some of them were new companies, some of them were divisions of old companies, but nonetheless, that whole infrastructure built out and made the industry what it is today. A second phenomenon is the unparalleled globalization of the semiconductor industry. And I think this is really important because this started a very long time ago. Globalization has resulted in a degree of interdependence that is unmatched in any other industry in the world today. And I think that that's something that is going to be very important as we look at the nanoelectronics era in the years ahead. The innovation ecosystem is by necessity a regional system, but it also has as a part of it a global context. The semiconductor innovation ecosystem is the driving force for the IT progress that has taken place today and has been for the last many years. And I can't stress enough how important that ecosystem is, starting with basic research at our universities, consortia research, pre-competitive research at our companies, the commercialization, the manufacturing, and that full loop that continues to work. In the absence of that ecosystem, what we have been talking about and what we're looking forward to would not exist. The World Wide Web has accelerated the globalization of the industry. Engineers trained in Korea or Japan or the US or Europe may find themselves working in a design lab or in a manufacturing facility in California or France or somewhere in China or Taiwan. They aren't relegated to any geography. There's opportunity around the world for them. Wafer fabrication is about as widespread as you can imagine. Virtually every company that is a major player in this industry has major manufacturing capability around the world. In fact, Samsung just announced within the last couple of days a new manufacturing facility in Austin, Texas that eventually will be an investment of some $3 billion, as any wafer fab is in this business. Assembly and test operations are largely concentrated out here in Asia. In fact, I came to Korea the first time in 1967 to set up a assembly and test operation here for Motorola. And at that stage, one would have to look at Korea and say, there's a lot of promise here, but there's a long way to go. And some 40 years later, it's just a wonderful experience for me to come back here and see the progress that has been made in that 40 years here in Korea. It's been just remarkable what has been accomplished. China has become the electronics manufacturing powerhouse of the world. About 30% of all these semiconductors today are being put into boards and boxes in China. By the year 2010, about 40% will be in China. So clearly, it is now the largest market. It will continue to be the largest market for the foreseeable future. They are also becoming a very large consumer. And as you look at the statistics today, I think they are number one in the purchasing of cell phones today. They're either number 2 or number 3 in PCs and moving up rather quickly in consumer products like television and digital cameras and so on. Again, they rank in the top 2 or 3. The question really is, are they going to establish standards that will make it more difficult for the rest of the industry around the world to be a part of those markets as they unfold? And again, I think that's one of the things that has been one of the great strengths of this industry, is that the evolution of the standards have been very broadly based and have allowed a lot of players to become important contributors to the industry, whether they happen to be a software applications company playing onto a Microsoft platform, or if they are making some of the chips that surround a microprocessor that comes from a TI or a DSP that comes from, or from Intel rather, or a DSP that comes from TI, or on and on. All of these things have allowed a very large community around the world to be players. And it's going to be important to make certain that that happens in the future. Because if you think about it, it's easy to see how an engineer here in Korea could conceive of a device that they need for a PDA and maybe send that design thought to a company in, let's say, Europe at ST, and they would design the product, and they would send it to a foundry, maybe their own or one in Taiwan or Singapore, that would make that chip, have it assembled maybe in Malaysia, put it in a board in China, and maybe send it to a customer in New York. I mean, that is the kind of interdependence, globalization that is taking place in this industry, and is again one of the things that has made it so strong. So some of the factors that have helped us to be so global is, one, near universal agreement on the elimination of barriers to international commerce in information technology products. Clearly, free, fair trade is good for consumers as well as good for the manufacturers of IT products. 64 WTO signatories are members of the Information Technology Agreement that eliminates tariffs, all tariffs, on IT products. Recognition of the strategic importance and the economic benefits of playing a role in the IT industry. Governments around the world have sought to attract investments in IT. And the speed at which technology transfers across borders promotes collaboration between companies in different countries around the world. The process that I'm talking about here drives technology transfer. And I think, as those of you that are involved in technology know well, technology transfers through people, not through paper. Paper is only a backup. It's really in the minds of those people that study, work, learn, apply, that make that transfer. Access to world-class engineering schools in the United States, in Europe, Japan, and now in Korea and other places in the world are increasing an important part of this global ecosystem. Adoption of effective intellectual property protection laws and rigorous enforcement of IP rights is another essential element for this industry to continue to do what it has. Various forms of industrial policy, such as tax holidays, grants, and subsidies, they'll influence site location and investment decisions. However, it is my view that constructive comparative advantage will have limited success if the companies involved do not emerge as important players, as they have in some instances and have not in others and have failed, or if the rest of the competition around the world take countermeasures to neutralize that capability. So the globalization of semiconductors is likely to continue as other nations begin to become players, whether it's India, Brazil at some stage, Russia further down the road, who knows. But globalization has also helped drive other trends in the industry. Research and development is moving outside of manufacturing companies. There's a growing demand for a closer relationship between design and manufacturing as we continue to shrink dimensions and encounter less predictable material performance. That is becoming increasingly important as we go down from 65 nanometers to the 45 nanometer node. The predictability that has been a part of the CMOS scaling is far less predictable than it once was. The other thing that is important as we go down to these finer geometries, the cost to not only design, but to bring the mask set to the marketplace and to build that product is becoming much more expensive. New designs today are costing upwards of $50 million So you have to be right the first time. You cannot afford to be wrong on that first turn of silicon. Centers of excellence located around major research universities will take over the role of Bell Labs. And this, I think, is an important paradigm shift. And again, we were talking about this morning at breakfast. That's the way that we are driving technology in the U.S. We have major universities, but then we draw in consortia with those major universities a whole host of others to make sure that we can get the best and the brightest working on these problems. IP royalty is going to become a far more important part of this business going forward. In the past, it was a very, very tiny part. You now see IP companies popping up all over the place. You have Rambus in the memory area. You have Tesaris that deals with the assembly and the packaging of some of these areas. You have Intermoleculars dealing with other applications and process technology. There's going to be more and more of that. As a consequence, you're going to have companies that need this technology, they can't do it on their own, that will be contracting with these people. They'll have a whole new method by which they implement new technology. It will not be coming out of their research laboratory any longer. I actually think that as we go down through the 45 nanometer node, we will also see the first indications of how nanotechnology is going to play into this business over the next 10 years. I think at that stage we're going to have some problems that will need the kind of capability that nanotechnology provides, where you have very, very strong adhesion capabilities between two materials that are matched very, very well, and eliminate some of the other aspects of current CMOS scaling technology with the photoresist and all the other things you have to do. We'll be able to skip some steps, do some things better, and eliminate some of the problems that are out there ahead of us. The other thing that I think is going to be important as we go down through these next phases and where nanotechnology will help us is we're going to have some problems with power consumption, and I think we're going to be able to overcome that by utilizing nanotechnology as we deal with the gate stack. I don't want to go into that very much, but my point is, actually, if you didn't solve that problem from where we are today in the next two generations of products, they would get so hot they would vaporize. They just couldn't. They wouldn't be able to stand the heat. That'll never happen. I think we know how we're going to solve that problem, and we will. Cross-border relationships are going to be increasingly important. New types of relationships will emerge. They will involve design support, foundry services, process technology packages. So again, that little scenario I gave you about thinking about the product here, having to design somewhere else and so on, is going to be very, very much a part of how many, many businesses will be functioning. One of the issues I think we need to take a look at and kind of keep in mind is, as we go through this process, is it likely that foundries will decide that they want to capture more of the added value that their fabless companies are getting, and therefore integrate back and become a part of the fabless foundry business from both sides, the foundry as well as the fabless design? Now I know if you talk to most of them, you'll find they say, no, we're not going to do that. But there comes a time when that may be a very reasonable thing for them to do, and they will be the only ones who could actually accomplish that. So I think that is a challenge that lies out there ahead of us. Manufacturing is going to be the easiest part of the problem to solve for the rest of the CMOS scaling era. And the reason for that is it is very tightly aligned with the process technology. The design part of the issue going forward is going to be more difficult. The reason for that is the way we're doing the design tools, they're fairly independent of what the process technology involves. And if you look at the capability of the process technology and the equipment, it is growing at a very rapid slope. If you look at the EDA world, those design tools, it is a much slower slope. And as a consequence, the delta between the two is getting larger and larger. And what that's doing is providing an opportunity for more and more companies to become players in the EDA world. Because again, the barrier to entry is very, very low. Another thing that is going to emerge as we go forward, because of the complexities of this whole integrated and global system, is the need for a lot of data warehousing and the movement of that data around the world rapidly and effectively. The amount and the variations of that data to be successful is going to be immense. It's going to create new challenges in that there will be so many different access points for both inputting and retrieving that data and utilizing it that it's going to have to be integrated very, very effectively. And a lot of people think, well, you just add one more computer to that network and one more computer and that's all going to work just fine. But I did hear someone say at one stage that we know one, and we know one and two. We also know two. What we don't know, we go beyond two, is what does the and mean, and how does it impact the complications going forward. And I think that's what this is all about. This is going to be a challenge of the multi-computer, the multi-data, the multi-sequencing, and so on environment that's going to be out there that we're going to have to deal with in this globalized world. It will be far more complex than anything we've dealt with at this stage. So I want to throw out some questions here I want you to think about, and then I'll finish up my talk here in a few minutes. But some of the questions that have come out of all this is, which of the business models I've described, the industrial policy model followed by Japan, to a lesser degree Korea, the entrepreneurial model exemplified by the United States, and to some extent by China, Taiwan perhaps, Korea to some degree, or something in between such as the model of Europe and Taiwan. Which is most likely to be successful in the scramble for leadership in the nanoelectronics era? I want to talk about that in our Q&A. Is the entrepreneurial climate of the U.S. transplantable? I can't tell you how many people have come to see me in the Silicon Valley and say, how do we start a Silicon Valley? I don't think you start a Silicon Valley. I think a Silicon Valley starts on its own. It happens because of the universities, of the entrepreneurs, of the venture capital, on and on and on. It's something that you can't just put out there and say, now we've got it. It doesn't happen that way. What is China's role going forward? Does it matter if the EU resolves its governance issues in some of the areas that are unfolding out there now? What are the essential elements of an innovation ecosystem that will contribute to a successful information technology? Can the innovation ecosystem be global and not regional? I'll tell you, that's a very important question. I know it works in a regional context. I'm not certain it works in a global context. When will India, Brazil, Russia, Eastern Europe countries become a factor? What role will they play? Will they be able to catch up? Does it matter how the Middle East issues are resolved and who will benefit and who will be burdened? Will energy policy play a role in the outcome? And how important are cultural differences in contributing to a climate for innovation? Now, for as long as I've been involved in this industry, and it's almost from the very first day, I've been in it just about 50 years now, we've tracked global sales of semiconductors, and the U.S. has been fortunate to have led this parade for all but a very few years in the late 1980s, when Japan took over. Now we regained leadership and had about 50% of the worldwide market since then. However, Asia Pacific is becoming a bigger factor and growing more rapidly. And the question is, who is it that is going to give ground to Asia Pacific as their market share continues to grow? And I think it's inevitable that it will. If you look at that chart right there, you can see that it has grown from roughly 2% of the market a few years back to 6.5% in Taiwan. Korea has gone from 7% or so to nearly 11%. So there's going to be more of that going on, and there's going to be more and more competition for that marketplace that's out there. Now, as a result of all of this, major innovations in semiconductors, such as the DRAM and the microprocessor, played a major role in ensuring that U.S. leadership in the computation and the communications markets continued. And our definition of IT, incidentally, is a combination of computation and communications. The creation of the Internet was a logical development out of the proliferation of all of these things that came together. They converged in the mid-1990s. You had the very early stages of an Internet capability. You had now some very good and getting faster computers. We had operating systems that were far less buggy and far more useful. We had application software packages now that were really much more reliable and working better. And you go on down that list of things that all of a sudden converged, and we had this Internet that created a whole new industry out there. But in addition to that, and something we don't see quite as much and think about, is the advances in the life sciences. Could not have occurred without the advances in information technology driven by semiconductors. And as a result, people are living longer and much healthier today than they were. The slide I have up there, Professor Dale Jorgensen, one of Harvard University's foremost economists, has observed that the economics of information technology begins with a precipitous and continuous fall in the semiconductor prices. He credits the rapid adoption of information technology in the United States for driving substantial economic growth in the U.S. and, as a consequence, the productivity enhancements that I alluded to earlier. He went on to say that since 1995, information technologies have accounted for 25% of overall economic growth, while only 3% of the GDP, as I mentioned earlier. The results of that technology, and I just put this one slide in here because I think it's quite useful. The improvements in drive productivity have been calculated at the Bureau of Economic Affairs in the U.S. government. So they looked at local, state, and federal governments' purchase of compute capability over the last 10 years. And they spent, I'll try and just frame this for you. As you can see, that bottom line is almost flat. They've paid about $8 to $10 billion a year for all the new compute capacity they bought. But if the 1995 prices had been in effect that entire time, instead of paying roughly $360 million, they only paid about $80 billion. So there's $180 billion savings because of these cost reductions, these productivity enhancements, and the greater functionality that comes with these computers that are coming out year in, year out, along with the communications products with them. I think one of the things that is quite clear, when you look at the advances that are being made today, I think when the cost of flash memory, for example, gets below $50 for a rotating memory application, it will replace rotating memory. And I think as a consequence, within 5 years, we'll have laptops that have no rotating memory. They'll just be flash driven. As I said in the opening of my remarks today, increasing worker productivity will be an imperative for many of the world's industrialized nations. The world's population is aging, and this phenomenon is happening most rapidly in the world's most advanced economies. Over the next 30 years, there will be a dramatic increase in the proportion of the population over 65 age in China, North America, and South America. However, South Korea faces the most serious challenge of all, followed closely by Japan. In 2050, nearly 40% of Korea's population will be over 65, and Japan will be about as severe. So I think this, again, is an issue that is going to be rather critical and demands that we all be a very effective, contributing part to this information technology that drives that productivity that is going to deal with that aging problem that's out there ahead of us. With fewer workers actively producing goods and services to support larger numbers of retired workers who will tend to consume a high proportion of very costly services such as healthcare, the only practical solutions are to drive dramatic increases in productivity among active workers while applying technology to help control the cost of services. The challenge we now face is to proliferate the adoption of information technology solutions throughout the healthcare system to drive down the cost of delivery of medical care. Now I know in the U.S., I suspect the same is true here. The largest uncontrolled major issue cost-wise for the United States is the cost of health care going out the next 20 to 50 years. That problem is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. We've gone from roughly 14% of the GDP going to health care to 17% and continuing to decline. We've got to find a way to solve that problem. I suspect Korea does as well. Now, historically, there's been a lag of about 15 years from the beginning of basic research to commercial applications of the new technology. And if you think about it, 2020 is about 15 years away. And as I said earlier, by that time, CMOS scaling will have hit its physical limits, and nanotechnology will take over. So the global scramble for leadership in nanotechnology and nanoelectronics is now underway. And as a consequence, anytime there is a tectonic shift of this kind, whether it was the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century or the invention of the transistor back in 1947, there's an opportunity for dramatic changes in the world order. Obviously, we in the U.S. information technology industry have a strong desire to maintain our leadership. But the outcome of this scramble for leadership is by no means certain. For our part, we are working to strengthen our innovation ecosystem on a number of fronts. We're seeking significant increases in funding of basic research at American universities in the physical sciences to keep them at the forefront of basic research. We're working to improve K-12 education systems so that we'll become less dependent on international students to supply the scientists and the engineers tomorrow. Now again, for those of you who have ever seen the data, 3/4 of the graduate students in the physical sciences in the U.S. universities are foreign-born. And we like that. That's great. But we also recognize universities around the world are getting better. More and more of these young people are going to decide they would rather do their graduate work in their home country as opposed to coming to the U.S. So we want to make sure that we have a supply of these bright students. But at the same time, we want to make certain that our leading education and research institutions are open and attractive to the best and the brightest young students from around the world as they have been in all the years past. And finally, we're working to improve the investment climate for information technology industries in America while opposing measures that would direct or control the free flow of capital between nations or impede free, fair, and open markets around the world. Our view is that investment decisions ought to be based on what makes business sense, not in government industrial policy. So the global scramble for leadership is good. Competition is the greatest driver of progress. While there will be a winner in this scramble for leadership, just as there is today, there will be no losers. Because everyone is going to benefit from the progress in information technology, and people everywhere will enjoy a better quality of life as a result of the continuous progress that IT brings to our communities and to us as individuals. So thank you. Now I'll open it to questions.